One thing that has been garnering a lot of attention in the trade press is the recent flurry of activity around American truck drivers' ability to speak English proficiently. The regulations in place since the 1930s require a driver to be proficient, but not fluent in English, a measure meant to facilitate communication with the public, with law enforcement, and of course, to improve safety on our roadways. In recent decades, America has had, to say the very least, a back-and-forth relationship with this rule. From its inception until 2007, drivers could be cited for a lack of proficiency, but were free to go on their way. From 2007 to 2016, less than proficient drivers could, but were not always, put out of service. In 2016, we reverted to the previous, and a few weeks ago, all that changed again. Over the last few weeks, we've seen an executive order, emergency action by the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance, and a heavily redacted FMCSA enforcement memo, all of which led to more and more questions. How will this rule be enforced, and how should motor carriers and drivers respond? This episode comes at an opportune time. We are so thankful to Adrienne Gildea, Deputy Executive Director at the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance, who came to us fresh off a CVSA board meeting that focused heavily on this topic. She and my fellow co-director Steve Keppler, a board member himself, spoke at depth about recent CVSA deliberations and what the upcoming two-part roadside proficiency test would look like and how roadside inspections are expected to change. They also revealed what follow-on action, including rulemaking petitions and guidance requests, that we can expect. Also joining us for this podcast was Chris Eckhart, partner at the Scopelitis Law Firm. Chris points out the important difference between proficiency and fluency, which further complicates this issue. He points out legal questions motor carriers will need to grapple with as they adapt to the new landscape, including potential employment law liability concerns carriers will need to navigate, to say the very least. Finally, and as always, we were pleased to welcome back to the podcast Mr. Bert Mayo of TrueNorth. Bert, as an unrelenting advocate for truckers and motor carriers, drilled into the really tough practical impacts of this change and how motor carriers and drivers should respond if and when they're placed out of service, and whether this will truly impact safety. This is one of the most candid and informative and at times downright entertaining conversations we've had, complete with legal nuance, enforcement insight, southern accents, and a few cultural references we didn't even see coming. If you're new to the Triple T Pod, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our new content released monthly. And if you're a regular listener, we'd love it if you could leave a review so others know where to find us. Now, let's get into it. All right, today I have with me some old friends and some new faces. As always, with me is my partner in trucking safety, my ride to not die, Steve Keppler. Also joining us for the umpteenth time is our favorite Southern gentleman, Bert Mayo, Risk Solutions Specialist with TrueNorth Companies. He's here to provide some of the practical perspective that we think carriers are going to need on this topic. We've also lawyered up today, invited Chris Eckhart, partner at the Scopelitis Law Firm, to bring a little legal insight into the guidance, what this guidance could mean to carriers, operation and liability. And last and definitely not least, first time on the podcast, Adrienne Gildea, the amazing, fantastic, and intensely knowledgeable Deputy Executive Director at CVSA. She's been there for 14 years, and she's going to try to help us understand what exactly this might mean from a roadside perspective for this brave new world, sort of old world too. So welcome everybody to the podcast. Really appreciate y'all being here.
Thanks. Adrienne, I wrote that script for him to say. So.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to have to live up to that now. There's a lot of pressure.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. Maybe just to start off, Adrienne, start with you, just kind of the elevator speech on what the executive order from the president kind of outlines for us on this ELP issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So, right off the bat, it directed FMCSA to rescind their existing guidance on enforcing the driver qualification standards in 391.11b2. And so they did that immediately. Also directed FMCSA to work with CVSA to get the violations of 391.11b2 back in the out-of-service criteria. Our board took action back on May 1st to to do that, to add it back to the out of service criteria, effective June 25th, to comply with the 60-day timeline that was set forth in the executive order. It takes a little bit of time to get everything in place and get everybody schooled up on how to move forward. And so we delayed the implementation to the end of June. And then it directed FMCSA to put out guidance on what compliance with 391.11b2 means. And so they issued that a couple weeks ago. We met last week with the board meeting and talked about it a little bit more. And now we're just kind of gearing up for June 25th.
You know, the timing on this executive order was kind of bonkers, right? I mean, you all, the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance, and for anybody listening to the podcast doesn't know, they represent and help coordinate our roadside inspectors and law enforcement folks to enforce the laws. And y'all have two meetings, annual, more than two, but two kind of big meetings annually. And you were just sort of gathering for this meeting when this executive order came out. And then right away had to dive in to creating these out-of-service criteria. What was it like in that room? I know, Steve, you were in that room too. How did that debate go? Was there consensus? Did you know for sure, like, you were going to have to create this out-of-service criteria right away? Just set the scene for me, because I just feel like I know you guys have debated this in the past as well, and those debates have gone differently. So what was it like in that room that week?
Yeah, I mean, the timing was, it was very stressful, but actually quite convenient, because to your point, we had everybody together and we could have the discussion, right? So that was good. It actually, news of the executive order leaked out into the trade press on the first day of our conference while we were meeting with our lead agency contacts, who could not have timed it better in terms of the news getting out, because I had all 70 of our lead agency contacts sitting in a room talking about the future of the organization, what our vision is, what our plan is. And then so we were able to kind of temperature check with them. This item was already on the agenda for the Driver Traffic Enforcement Committee prior to the executive order coming out, because we had received a couple of requests from members to talk about it again and put it in the out-of-service criteria. So we were already planning to talk about it. But obviously, the executive order changed the discussion, because it became pretty clear very quickly that this was a directive from the federal government. And, you know, the membership pretty much agreed very quickly that this is something that we just had to do and respond to. So the conversation really shifted to not should we do this and how do we do this, shifted from should we do this to how do we do this and how do we comply with this directive.
What do you think, Steve? You were in that room too. Was it pretty raucous, or how did it go?
It was. I tell you, that for those of you that haven't been to a CVSA meeting or understand the organization, it's a pretty amazing organization in the way that and what they do and how they do it. And typically the out of service criteria goes into effect every April of each year. And in this case, the organization made an exception to that, which is something that's rare. But this is, ever since I've been involved, it's been a very contentious issue. Some people go back and forth. Is it an officer safety issue? Is it a highway safety issue? And that becomes part of the conversation. And I think in this case, it was pretty amazing to see the kind of people align, fairly quickly and act quickly. I still think there's some questions as to how, and we'll get through the rest of the podcast, but some of those things that I think still are outstanding. But it was contentious. But I think everyone came to. I think the value of the organization is everyone can say their piece, right? And so they're very transparent. It's a collaborative conversation, and so I think everyone came into alignment.
Quick plug for CVSA. When I started going to CVSA years and years ago, good friend Jason Wing came up to me and he said, dollar for dollar, this is the most value I get out of any meeting that he goes to. So if you're a motor carrier out there and you're thinking, where can I get a lot of value? Well, these are sort of the boots on the ground. The issues they talk about there are the issues that impact motor carriers and drivers on roadside every day. So quick, easy plug for Adrienne and that great organization. So CVSA passes the out-of-service criteria sort of on an emergency basis. there were a few other things that went along with that, right, Adrienne? Are there some petitions that we expect to happen, or can you sort of talk about, the final result of that meeting?
Yeah, absolutely. So in addition to the emergency action to add to the out-of-service criteria, the board passed 2 additional actions related to this topic. And both came out of the driver committee as well as kind of a package deal. So the second piece is that we are drafting a petition to FMCSA to add the out-of-service requirement to the regulations themselves. There are a handful. If you go look at the definition of out-of-service in 390.5T, there are a handful of very specific regulations that are required to be out of service per the regulations themselves. For example, possession of alcohol. And so it lists those specific sections, and then it also says, or the CVSA out of service criteria. And so because the justification for putting this in the out of service criteria was the executive order, was that action by the administrative portion of the government, we believe it's appropriate for FMCSA to adopt that out of service piece into the regs themselves, just to provide that kind of backing and justification for it. So we'll send that petition shortly. We wanted to have some additional discussions and talk with our board again, just to make sure we had everything ready to go before we start sending documents over. So we'll do that. And then the third one was part of the discussion that we had was, and these drivers have CDLs, you know what I mean? And so they passed the entry level driver training. They went to SDLA and got a driver's license. And so how did that happen that they got a credential and then are no longer qualified to drive like the next day, right? And so there was a discussion in the committee about there appears to be a disconnect between the CDL requirements in 383 and the driver qualification requirements in 391. So the board also approved a petition to FMCSA asking the agency to harmonize those 2 sections to make sure that the requirements to get a CDL are consistent with the requirements to drive a truck. And so that was going to take a little bit more nuance. We actually, at our board meeting last week, the board voted to table that petition, essentially send it back to the driver committee to have some more discussion on it, because we need some more details, some more examples of where is the disconnect and how does that happen, and really dig into, is there a disconnect, or is it simply people were getting a credential that they should not have? And so we made the out of service criteria change. We're going to petition the agency to amend the regulations, and at our conference in Denver in September, we'll revisit the disconnect between 383 and 391 to see if there's work that needs to be done there.
Adrienne, can we just pause there for a second? I don't want to dig in why and start the finger pointing on that. But having been at motor carrier, as most of us have, and I use Florida because when I trucked, I was in Florida, and this was in the 90s. Florida was given the CDL exam in Spanish then. Florida would give the CDL. And so then to that point, when you say the SDLAs, is that the next intent?
Driver's licensing agency, just so we're clear on that.
To try to correct that? Because again, these states have been doing this for 20 plus years.
Yeah, and a lot of the states are required to do that because of their own kind of Title VI requirements and laws and things like that. And that's as much as I'll get into legal stuff, but I know that it is a Title VI type of thing.
That's why
and there are states. I'm just going to stop right there. The states are required to do that. They do have to do the skills test and all of that in English without an interpreter, as you guys know. But the requirement to offer the CDL test in another language is kind of outside of our purview. There was a lot of discussion in our board meeting and committee about whether or not that does allow for this disconnect, right? I can take the test in one language and then, required to speak a different one. But again, the skills test and the demonstration of the ability to operate the truck safety have to be done in English. And so that's kind of where we hope we close that loop.
I think that's such an interesting component to the conversation, because I know there's been a lot of talk about, well, you're giving all these tests in English. It's worth mentioning that the skills test is pretty robust, right? There are 3 distinct portions to it, and it could be pretty hard to pass it if you don't speak English proficiently. And that sort of brings us to this question about how well are the states doing? How much are they following that? What's the impact of third-party testing? There's a lot to unpack there. But we have a lot to cover on this podcast. So,
but before we leave that point, I think, and I don't want to dig in any deeper on that, but I think the thing to keep in mind on that issue is we're only talking about the CDL. The non-CDL, this executive order applies to all drivers, right? Not just CDL drivers. So that's a category I think that could be part of this challenge.
Oh man. All right. Well, so you pass the out of service order. This is nice. We're going chronological order. That doesn't normally happen. Pass the CDL or pass the out of service criteria, and part of it was like we need to wait for guidance from FMCSA because they need to tell us what it means to be proficient in English and how we're going to test that and so on and so forth. FMCSA did that pretty quickly, actually, a couple weeks. Who wants to take a stab at telling us what's in that guidance? Probably on the hot seat today, Ms. Gildea.
Yeah, happy to. So essentially, FMCSA put out their guidance, and it is for inspectors as they're doing their roadside inspection. As they start their communication with the driver, they start the driver interview, they kind of get the sense that the driver is maybe not able to communicate, they're not understanding, they're not responding like they're getting the questions, then they're supposed to initiate this two-part test to evaluate compliance with 391.11b2. And I think that's an important distinction. We refer to this as English language proficiency, but it's actually compliance with 391.11b2, which is, it includes English language proficiency, but it also includes the ability to read highway signs and things like that, right? So it's not just English language, it is the ability to operate the vehicle in the language in the country that you're driving. So two-part test, you start with a couple of driver interview questions, standard stuff that a driver would get asked anyways. There's nothing in there that's a gotcha question or anything like that. It's normal questions the driver would experience in roadside inspection.
Not a spelling test or anything.
Not a spelling test, not what happened last week on, The Last of Us or anything like that. Just normal driver questions during a roadside inspection. And so, if the inspector is satisfied with the driver's responses, it's clear that they understand and are receiving answers that make sense, then they proceed to part two, which is to evaluate the driver's ability to read standard highway signs. So they'll see a couple of signs and they have to be able to communicate to the inspector what those signs mean. And then if they pass that, they're good. They have passed the screening or met the qualifications in the guidance, and the inspector goes on with the rest of their inspection and moves along. If the driver cannot communicate to the inspector clearly in English in part one of the test, then the inspector does not have to proceed to the signs part because they've already failed the first half of the test, so they don't have to go to the second half, and they are in violation of 391.11b2, and they are placed out of service.
I think the one thing that I'll add to that, Adrienne, and maybe it came up in the board meeting discussion, was the distinction. It's not just read; it's comprehend, right, and understand, and that's in the rule. And I think there was some conversation as to, okay, well, because there's picture signs, there's textual signs. What's the agency's direction here? And I think FMCSA was clear. It's not just being able to read, but also understand what the pictograms mean and be able to communicate that to the inspector. So that's an important distinction. I think people need to be aware of.
I had just a quick question. There's the two steps, step one, step two. If there is a violation that's found, will there be any indication, do you think, from roadside enforcement at whether it was a step one or a step two violation?
Yeah, absolutely. Part of the guidance is for the inspector to very clearly document, where and how and why the driver failed to meet the standard. You know what I mean? We talked about that a lot in the board meeting. I think the states will be instructing their inspectors to, in their inspector note sections, say which questions they weren't able to answer and how, which signs they weren't able to identify and that sort of thing. So there will be some very clear information because they have to document how they came to the conclusion that the driver doesn't meet the standard to the point where they were put out of service. So it will be very clear in the inspection notes at what point the driver was not able to.
That's good. And the motor carriers that we've been counseling on this issue regularly, they're asking, well, what do we do in response to a violation? And part of normal violations is, hey, there's an opportunity for training. And so those two buckets are a different animal, I think. Being able to understand the traffic signs, and you can train on that, I think, a little more easily than being able to proficiently speak with a roadside enforcement and answer those questions. And so at least that will be an opportunity for training and knowing what the violation was so that you can demonstrate response to it if the carrier intends to keep that driver operating.
Well, also in the training piece, is that first set of step one driver interview questions, are those going to be standard, kind of off the shelf, or will they be just kind of what the inspector, general conversation, what's on your truck, what's your driver, what's your home address, those kind of things? Is it a set group that we can begin training with, or could it be anything?
It can be anything. It's not a set group. I mean, there are some recommended questions and some for examples, but it really is as you're conducting your driver interview type of stuff. And so, because as you're doing your inspection, it could go any number of ways. And, as the inspector is investigating hours of service and logbooks and things like that, you could, in theory, have a driver who is trained up enough to know, answers to the first standard 6 questions, right? But they don't actually understand the questions. They don't actually understand their answers really either. They just know what they're supposed to say in response to those questions. And so it's not like you're going to get asked the exact same questions in the exact same order, but I do want to stress they are questions that your driver should know the answer to. They are normal roadside inspection questions.
Where are you heading? What's your freight? That kind of stuff.
Those types of things. Exactly. Those types of things. And, one of the things we talked about in our meeting last week and clarified is they are questions the driver should know the answer to. But if they don't know the answer for some reason, like, oh man, I don't know, that's okay. The answer I don't know is okay, as long as I understood the question and I genuinely don't have the information you're asking. Maybe it's a sealed load and you don't necessarily know exactly what's back there because you just picked up a sealed load. But, hey, what are you hauling? I don't know. I picked it up and it was sealed. And then clearly you understood the question and you could communicate back an answer. So the point is that the driver needs to be able to understand and respond to requests and communicate with the inspector. So if they get something wrong or if they don't know the answer, that's not going to disqualify them. It is not being able to communicate and understand. And again, questions that only pertain to their job as a truck driver. Nobody's going to ask them to summarize. We made this trip last week, like weathering heights or anything like that. We're not going to quiz you on what happened on last week's night. It is really related to the responsibilities associated with driving the truck.
Man, we have got a lot of cultural references coming from Adrienne today, which I love. I think some of the challenge here is
Sean, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I don't want to lose sight of Chris's point because I think it's important. Chris's question about documenting the violations, because that's going to be important in order to cure the out of service condition, right? So the driver and the carrier are going to need to know why the driver was put out of service so they know what to do to get back into service. So I think that's an important point that I didn't want to lose sight of before we move on.
Is that going to go in the notes section, or because I think not all states provide the notes? Like how are we going to see that on the report? Do we know? That was
what talked in the board meeting. That was what was discussed, putting it in the notes section.
Oh, do all states provide the notes section now? I know historically maybe that wasn't always the case, the officer notes.
I'm not aware of you in a motor carrier not being able to get their notes available. If that is the case, then we can figure that out. I mean, I think the idea and the inspector, we want the drivers to be able to get back into service. We want the motor carriers to be able to get their drivers back into service too. And so, if we do find that that's a sticking point because the notes sections are not, we'll revisit it and figure out how to address that.
Awesome,
Steve. I don't want to be as rude as Steve, but I will be. I mean, I think this is the issue. If I hear a question over and over, it's that. Thank you, Chris, for setting up. How do I get my driver back on the road? Because given what I know to be true in southern states right now, there's going to be a lot of trucks parked in the first month of this. And getting someone to speak proficient English within 30 days is going to be a challenge.
I mean, just look at Bert.
Well, Southern English is a thing, Sean, whether you like it or not. So I guess, Adrienne, and just understanding the diversity of the states, the biases that exist today with, unsafe driving in certain states and vehicle maintenance in certain states. Can we make an assumption some states like Texas, who have a lot more proficient Spanglish speaking enforcement officers, this could be all over the board depending on the state, right?
Yeah, I think we're trying to figure that out right now. I mean, the requirement to be able to communicate in English and understand road signs is an existing regulation. It's been on the books since, forever. The only thing that's changed is the out of service piece of it. So hopefully, motor carriers and drivers are making sure that they're compliant with that regulation. It is made very clear that if an inspector feels like a driver cannot communicate and therefore is not compliant, then the first part of the test has to be done in English. They are not permitted to do step one of the test in any other language. They have to approach the driver, speak to them and ask their questions in English and receive answers in English. And so even if, and that's something we've talked about, guys along the southern border, a lot of them speak Spanish, not even Spanglish, they speak Spanish. And so, they get along and do just fine with their driver interview if they have to do it in Spanish because that makes the driver more comfortable. But for the purposes of verifying compliance with 391.11b2, they have to do the driver interview in English.
I think I appreciate your comment, Bert, and I was kind of going in that same direction. I pulled some data. I got some data from our friends over at the Central Analysis Bureau, because this isn't the first time this was an out-of-service violation, right? So from 2007 to 2016, it was also an out-of-service violation. And what I found interesting was that the percentage, when they found an English language proficiency violation, they weren't always putting the driver out of service. And I know we've been talking about a lot of carrier anxiety here, and every time I fail this test, my driver's going to go out. But I'll figure out how Joey's going to maybe incorporate this chart into the podcast. But the experience from state to state was like vastly different, right? And no state put 100% of their drivers out of service. My state, South Dakota, they only put 16% of their drivers out of service. So if you got an ELP, an English language proficiency violation, most of the time it was just a violation. So there was that disparity. So I guess, do we think that, this is a different scenario because it comes behind an executive order and, a lot of just flurry of activity. So do we think that, the border states hardly put anybody out of service because of course this doesn't apply to the border zone folks. But what do you think, Adrienne? Do you think we're going to see a higher percentage of out of service, or is there discretion there for an officer to be like, you're not perfect, but so I'm going to write you the violation but let you go? Or how do you think that's going to play out?
So the right to the violation and let you go is not going to happen, because it is now out of service if you were in violation of this regulation, with the exception of the motor carrier drivers who are operating in those commercial zones along the southern border. There's a carve out for them. But for everybody else, if you get cited for 391.11b2, you will be placed out of service. It's not flexible in that sense. The inspection software will not be coded for that flexibility. There will be two different violation codes, one for the commercial zones and one for everybody else. So that flexibility goes away. But again, the inspector has to determine that the driver cannot communicate in English, right? So again, like, as long as you can answer my questions and it's clear that you understand, is your punctuation and grammar exactly right? No, but you obviously understand what I'm asking you and you can get your job done. That's okay. We're not trying to make sure that they speak like the Queen's English or anything like that. I guess the King's English now. I don't know. But again, it is when the driver cannot communicate in order to respond to inquiries from the inspector and understand roadway signs is when it becomes.
I think I hear what you're saying, Adrienne, but if I could kind of put myself in our clients' shoes right now, I think every one of them would wish that, Adrienne, you could conduct all the roadside inspections with that sort of approach to it. And I think the concern is, anytime the requirement under the regulation is proficiency at speaking, automatically there's subjectivity in the assessment of whether the driver meets that or not. And that's, I think it's an obvious point, but that is the major concern of motor carriers is there's going to be uneven enforcement. By definition, because of subjectivity, this is also a potential political issue as well. So that's the concern. And so I think it's very difficult without some clearer guidance from FMCSA on how to remediate the violation that really has motor carriers concerned about moving forward, especially if, as you say, there are no options roadside anymore. If there's a violation, they must put them out of service, unlike how it was when it wasn't out of service before 2016, I think.
That's almost a question for yourself, Chris. Like I would love to start moving into this part of the conversation where we start talking about how are carriers going to respond? I mean, how are they going to feel satisfied that they've cured the violation? How are they going to feel satisfied that their drivers are going to meet this subjective standard? I think, the enforcement community is doing everything they can to try to create a standard. So how would you answer your own question, Chris? How do we as a carrier feel satisfied that we can safely operate again without feeling nervous?
I don't mean to interrupt you again, Sean.
Yes,
or Chris,
you do, Steve.
But yeah, I'm going to. So, no, but this is an important conversation, and it came up in the board meeting this week, and a discussion about the fact that the guidance has redactions in the memo. So given it's a subjective rule, we need to advise industry as much as we can about what our expectations are. And so there was a conversation around the table, and the CVSA members around the table said, FMCSA, we would like for you to send out an unredacted memo. Let industry see what the questions are, what the signs are, so they know what to expect. And so that was something that the CVSA board requested of FMCSA to do, to release an unredacted memo. Now, whether they're going to do that or not, we'll see. But
this is going to sound ridiculous, but seriously, I just was able to travel overseas and I used a tool. So why can't drivers use Google Translator?
They used to be able to.
I mean, that's right. I mean, this is a large population. So why couldn't I use something that actually helped me translate that?
I mean, I get it, Bert, but that to me, that policy decision, I think, was made and rejected. And so the reality is motor carriers can't rely upon that. And so to answer your question, Sean, it's absolutely a tricky situation because, as I mentioned, the regulation requires proficiency. It doesn't require fluency. And so if a motor carrier reacts to an out-of-service violation by administering an assessment or training that really exceeds what is required to pass the regulatory requirement, it could face exposure for civil rights complaints, especially if there's selective enforcement of that assessment or that assessment has a disparate impact on a protected group. On the other hand, there needs to be some response to it to cure the out-of-service conditions. So I double down on Steve's point about releasing the questions and the guidance. I think it's out there, but just not officially out there. But my recommendation would be assessing drivers during onboarding and adhering as closely as you can to the FMCSA's guidance. Adrienne mentioned that the Q&A is really work-based questions, work-related questions, and the traffic signs are basic traffic signs that you would expect. There's old guidance memos out there. There's a lot of overlap. And the closer you adhere to the FMCS guidance, the more defensible it is in response to any sort of civil rights complaint. The other point is just making sure you're not selectively applying your rules. So if you're going to assess drivers during onboarding, assess all drivers during onboarding. If you're going to give opportunities for training in response to an out-of-service violation, provide that opportunity to all drivers. And as best you can, train your folks to have even application of that subjective component of the assessment. And then document the reasons why drivers couldn't pass, and evaluate to make sure the folks on the ground who are administering those tests are being consistent. And until we get clearer instructions, that's about the best you can do as a carrier to react to this.
Well, and to that point, I think Adrienne in the meeting, I don't want to speak for you here, but I don't know if you were planning to address it, but that conversation came up on the enforcement side in terms of selectively administering the questions to the drivers. Do you want to talk about how that conversation played out in the meeting?
Yeah, I was gonna address that. So, to your point, it becomes really subjective when you're trying to decide, do I think this driver's communication is not proficient and therefore I'm going to administer this test? That is fraught with subjectivity and inconsistency. And so there was a discussion at the board meeting about, in order for CVSA and our inspectors and our membership to be consistent and uniform in our enforcement of the regulations, which is our goal and our purpose, really every driver has to undergo this 2-part test. And so what we did was we updated our inspection procedures, the driver interview portion of the inspection procedures. They already said, ensure that the driver is capable of communicating sufficiently to understand and respond to official inquiries and directions. That's already part of, prior to this, the inspection procedures, how we train our inspectors to apply the regulations. Now we've added a note, refer to FMCSA enforcement guidance memo, blah, 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 the number for it. So now we are pointing all of the inspectors to the guidance memo as how they meet this step 3 of the inspection procedure. I know a number of states, even prior to the board meeting, had already decided they were going to tell their inspectors to apply this standard to all drivers, because you can't pick and choose, and they don't want to have their inspectors picking and choosing and open themselves up for that liability as well, right? And an inconsistent application of the standard. And so we've updated our inspection procedure to reference the enforcement memo itself. And again, when you really start to think about it, because step 1 of the guidance is to ask questions that are part of the driver interview, anytime you start the inspection and you start asking the driver interview questions, you have initiated step 1 of this process. And once you initiate step 1 of this process, if the driver passes, you have to initiate step 2, right? And so I think that what we're going to see is that most drivers are going to be subjected to this standard and go all the way through the test, if not all drivers.
So I just want to make sure I understood that point. So anytime an officer starts to communicate with the driver, you're saying trigger step 1, which then requires step 2. Does that mean every roadside inspection, the driver's going to have to demonstrate they can read traffic signs, for example?
Yes, I think in most jurisdictions that's going to be what happens. Now, I mean, again, the inspection procedure refers to the memo, which says if you believe the driver does not meet the standard, initiate the test. But the test is essentially the driver interview. The questions are standard driver interview questions. And once you start the driver interview questions and they pass, the guidance requires you to do step 2, which is the signs. So we're gonna we met last week. I keep saying it was last week, Steve, but it was just 2 days ago.
By the time this recording gets launched live, it'll be
at our board meeting this week. Our training team, part of it was to get additional feedback from FMCSA, clarify a couple of questions, and then have the board discuss what they wanted to do. And now our training team is going to be working to incorporate how to apply this standard into our training materials. And so, but I mean, most of the states were in agreement that they're going to make every driver go through this test so that they don't have to deal with subjectivity.
Yeah, that was certainly a big concern.
But also, I'm sorry to interrupt you there, Sean.
Yes.
Just jump in
Anybody
on
else
you.
want to interrupt me, or how's this going?
Chris hasn't done it yet, and then we've all done it. But again, I think the thing to keep in mind, again, is that these are all things that the driver should be able to do anyways. We do want the drivers to be able to understand road signs and respond to them correctly. We do need drivers to be able to understand the driving task and direction and things like that. And so it's not a new standard. It's just now a new threshold.
Adrienne, I completely agree, and it's been my response forever. The truth is, it goes back to Chris's subjectivity of proficient. They can drive, and they're safely driving. I mean, I don't want to debate this. I know Steve and I talked about it. Well, I don't think there's any data that supports non-proficient English-speaking drivers are having more accidents. I think they're getting along just well. It's just now the enforcement of it, and they've been driving for years. And the motor carrier, large motor carriers are now struggling with the out of service. What do you do? How do you train? What do you do once they get the out of service? How do you get them back on the road? Do you just sign it and say it's done and the truck moves, or do you have to prove to someone that they can? Because that's a big jump for me.
So I can answer that part. I think it's neither of those things necessarily, because essentially, if you have a driver who's placed out of service for not meeting the standard, then before they can go back into service, they have to meet the standard, right? You don't have to go prove to somebody that they met the standard, just like you don't have to prove you fixed anything else on the out of service situation, right? Like you fix it and you're responsible for making sure you do that. And if you put that driver or that truck back out onto the road and enforcement finds that you did not fix that problem, well, now you're in violation of not only your underlying regulation, but also violating an out of service order. So, you don't just sign a piece of paper and put them back on the road, because if they get stopped again, you're going to be in violation again and in violation of out of service order, which comes with more penalties. But you also, and I know that this is what makes it complicated, because there's no box you can check. There's no, hey, I sent them to this course and now they're proficient. There's no clear thing. And I understand that makes it very complicated for the motor carriers but I think you have to demonstrate that they can meet the standard of 391.11b2 to your own satisfaction before I would put the driver back out on the road. And that goes to the point about the memo and the redaction, and hopefully FMCSA finds a way to give you guys the information you need, whether it's releasing the non-redacted version or providing you guys with some other version of a standard.
I guess one thing I would add there, sorry, Steve, to jump in, but if you do have an out-of-service violation and are audited in a compliance review, I'm guessing the FMCSA is going to start to look for documentation of the motor carrier curing that out-of-service condition. And so I do think it's wise for carriers who intend to keep drivers operating under their authority and DOT number after an out-of-service violation to do something, to train on the signals, maybe do a role play in the yard where at some point the safety department needs to be comfortable that this driver can satisfy that requirement. And once that's done, document it. That way, if you are audited, you can demonstrate that you assessed and determined that the out-of-service condition had been cured. And then if that driver is cited by another enforcement officer based upon subjectivity again, that's maybe when difficult decisions must be made about employment status or contract status. But I would recommend at a minimum documenting, not just signing the piece of paper, doing the training, but documenting it so that you can demonstrate compliance in response to the out-of-service condition.
Yeah, and I think
they take the LMS, because let's face it, they're going to give them a 15-minute LMS on the road. They take it, they sign that off in their LMS system. And then again, that's my concern, is he gets stopped again. Is the motor carrier responsible at that point? Is, you said, Adrienne, because there's more subjectivity to that test, depending on the state.
And Bert, I think just a couple things, and you're right to ask these questions because we're getting them too. So just to pick up on Chris's points on a couple. Number one, and this came up in the board meeting, it's FMCSA's rule. They should be putting out an objective way to comply with it. And they haven't. So what do we have to go on? We have the enforcement memo. That's FMC. That's what we have FMCSA's interpretation of how to assess compliance. So that gets back to Chris's point. If so, that's one point. That's what we have to go on, and that's another reason why it should be unredacted. Number two, document. The inspection, getting documentation of what the noncompliance was, so that the carrier and driver know what was deemed to be noncompliant. And so if you can take those two things, right, and establish a documentation, okay, how did you address these two things, right, with those drivers, and how do you document that? That in my mind, you can substantiate, we attempted to cure the problem. Here's how we documented it. And if the driver gets pulled over down the road several weeks later and gets put out of service again, and so then that becomes an opportunity to data queue it, right? So we cured the out of service violation. Here's what we did. Here's how we documented it. We are challenging this out of service order on these grounds. So, and I think that's, from a practical standpoint, I think that's about all you can do.
So this is the roadside enforcement portion is an important portion, and it's a portion that's creating a lot of anxiety. But I want to get back to like proactively addressing this in your fleet. So I want to look to Chris. I want to look to Bert to provide a little bit of flavor. Besides, the answer is probably call your lawyer. We get that. Chris will be happy to take your call, I'm sure. But let's talk a little bit about practically how am I going to address this in my fleet today to prepare for what we've already discussed will begin happening on June 25th. How do I do that practically? We mentioned, role play in the yard, and what sort of documentation do you think I should have? Chris and Bert, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure, I can start. I think our clients are mostly taking different approaches when it comes to new hires and then their current fleet. The current fleet, especially for larger carriers, it's really administratively hard to assess, because they're already on here, and many have operated for years without ELP violations. And that, as Adrienne mentioned, that's been a regulatory requirement that's been on the book. So, but for new hires, we have a lot of clients doing their own assessment that kind of tracks what we've been talking about. There's a portion of it that is basic Q&A about loads and hours of service and where'd you come from today and how long you've been working, those sorts of questions. And then a lot of them are using, in some ways, multiple choice options for traffic signs and ticking through the obvious ones and just assessing success rates on those tests, applying them uniformly. That's a critical part. Everyone that has to pass those tests. But we have a lot of clients who have either asked about that sort of testing or have implemented it even before this executive order.
Why am I not doing it on the drivers I'm already hiring, or are you suggesting we shouldn't, or what's the concern?
Part of the problem is you can't selectively choose who you're going to assess. And so if you've got a fleet of 6,000 drivers, you can't just pick the ones who you think might have an issue. That gives you a lot of legal issues. So part of it's just the administrative burden, Sean. And then I will say I think there are some carriers who are in a wait and see approach with respect to enforcement and seeing, will there be uniform enforcement, and how's this going to play out, and where will the subjectivity be, which states are going to have harder enforcement and stricter enforcement and more lax enforcement. So
I think the other thing is like, where's the first legal challenge going to come from, right? Because I think we can all agree there will be one.
Yeah.
And then what does that do to the landscape once that happens?
The ground is shifting. What say you, Bert? What does insurance think about this? How should we do this to satisfy your people?
Again, I go back to the statement earlier. I've not seen the evidence that insurance is concerned about loss, and we haven't seen evidence that this creates more losses. I'm sure the simple, there's a lot of the insurance companies, including myself, supporting them. We'll do DQ file audits. We'll randomly sample 10 or so, and we will start looking for this testing, some type of testing motor carriers to employ as they hire drivers. But that's about it at this point. But the number one questions I'm getting are just what Chris addressed it. What do we do on the onboarding, and then what do we do when we have an out of service?
And Bert, following up on that, do you anticipate, if you see an uptick in violations or out of service, do you think that's going to impact on insurance rates?
If you are alert in one of the basics, insurance companies look at that. So we have to write some type of due diligence about what are they doing about it, and this will be a standard. They've employed this type of training or this type of education for these drivers.
Interesting concept about impact on basics. This goes in the driver fitness basic, right? So there's not a lot. I mean, it's pretty. Driver fitness basics tend to go up or down pretty quickly because there's not a ton of data in that particular space. So that's a totally different concept that I hadn't thought about, Bert. I'm going to start throwing alerts a little bit more than I want to, and then my insurers and my shippers are going to be less happy with me. So another interesting concept.
The other onboarding angle that I want to mention is that I've had several clients kind of try to wrestle with is we're talking about a minimum qualification in Part 391, but there's also the part of onboarding and qualification and orientation that is teaching these drivers about the safety policies of the company to ensure that they will operate safely for you. And when you have a fleet where English may not be their first language, many carriers would prefer to make those orientation materials bilingual. So that
I got many carriers that all the awareness posters, all of that stuff is bilingual.
And so they're right. So they're worried now about being kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because that's evidence in a future accident case that the driver isn't proficient, according to the plaintiff's attorney. We all know they're going to say that when it's completely two different standards. But that's another area that I think is an issue that this ELP mandate is causing some other concerns, during the onboarding process.
Not to further complicate that, but
it cannot get any more complicated.
Well, strap in. No, we were talking about the guidance, and I mentioned earlier that step one of the guidance requires the inspector to communicate with the driver in English. It requires the driver to communicate back to the inspector in English, right? Once that step has been met and checked off, we move on to the signs and explaining the roadway signs, at which point the driver, because they have already demonstrated English language proficiency, can communicate with the inspector in a different language, as long as, the inspector can ask about the roadway signs. And if the driver is more comfortable speaking in, Spanish or French or Russian or Mandarin or whatever, and the inspector happens to understand that language as well, they can then communicate in that language. So I think that guidance, that in the guidance recognizes that the important thing is for the driver to understand and be able to communicate what the signs mean. And so to your point about training, if you're training the drivers and you want to make sure they're really understanding it and their primary language is not English, I completely understand the desire to give them. That's why the CDL test, the written test for the CDL can be in different languages, because just because you can, communicate well enough to drive your truck and get from A to B and do all the things you need to do in English, but I would be more comfortable taking tests in English because that's my native language. And so it's a written test. It might be easier and more comfortable to take the test in a different language. And so it just makes it a little bit more complicated because you go from step one, which is mandatory everything in English, to step two, which can be in a different language or using and then you can finish the inspection using that translation app that you were talking about, Bert, or popping over to Spanish. So
tough spot. I want to be respectful of time here, so I think we got to kind of circle this up and bring it to a close. As always, I'll give everybody an opportunity to sort of say their final piece. I'm curious to hear from Adrienne if there are some next steps that CVS is going to be taking in the future and what those might be. I'd love to hear from Chris and Bert. What are the first three things that me as a safety director should do when my driver gets popped and put out on roadside? So I know those are two challenging questions to sort of exit with. I want to thank you, Adrienne, for sure, for being here. I know you've been very, very busy, but just your perspective, I think, is really helpful for the industry. Chris, of course, too, that legal perspective, very good. So I'm going to step away and say thanks, everybody. Leave those two questions on the table. You can either, punt or answer or however you like. Thank you guys for being here.
I'm happy to answer. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this. I love doing this sort of thing and talking about it. So I really appreciate the opportunity to participate today. I will say next steps for us is we will be updating our out-of-service criteria and updating all of our inspection procedures, like I mentioned. We will be sending out a memo to our members, making them aware of the impending change in the exact language, making them aware of the guidance and where to find it. And then we'll push it out on June 25th, and we will strive, our members and CVSA, we will strive to do as much as we can to make sure that this is enforced uniformly and consistently across the board. And what that looks like and how it actually shakes out, I think, will probably take some fine tuning. And so would encourage folks from the industry to continue to engage with your state partners, continue to engage with us, continue to engage with FMCSA as this rolls out so that we can implement it as effectively and I'm not going to say painlessly, but less painful as possible.
Yeah, thanks.
On your out-of-service question, I would say the safety director should, before that happens, make sure the company establishes a policy of what the company's going to do when it happens, follow the policy, and document what's been done.
Kind of go back to Chris's earlier statement. Motor carriers have to build in some type of testing quiz on onboarding, and then they have to have that work with your LMS partner, build your own module, work with your great insurance partners like TrueNorth to help build that. Once you get the out of service, how to get that driver through that, document that, and move forward. Although, Sean, I would like to ask you something. You got all this cab data, right, on where these violations have occurred historically. So can you build some routing software that gets us through those kind of those blue states that don't enforce as heavy?
Surprisingly, historically, some of the challenge states have actually been in the middle of the country as far as percentage of violations written. Those border states, they're pretty good at dealing with bilingual, and so
right.
The data is
come south. That's it. Move south.
That's it. Bert's got a place for us. Steve, what you got? Bring us home, buddy.
Well, thank you all for time today. This is a complex issue, and all of your perspectives certainly shed some light on it as we all try and plow our way forward here, ultimately trying to improve safety. So thank you again for your time and your expertise. It's much appreciated for our listeners.
Miss Adrienne, thank y'all so much. I see Sean and Steve all the time, but appreciate y'all being here. And
you too, Bert. Nice to meet you, Adrienne.
Great topic.
Thank you. Thanks
for listening to this episode of True North Truck Thought. If you enjoyed the topic today and want to tune in for future conversations here on the Triple T Pod, make sure to follow us. Also, please don't hesitate to let us know which topics you want us to cover in future episodes. Drop us a line in the comments section or send us an email to transportationnews@TrueNorthCompanies.com. Thanks and have a safe day.